Hello, everyone. Welcome to Loop and Learn's T1D speaker series. And tonight we're talking about a topic that I think is very critical for all of us who live with type 1 diabetes, whether you're taking insulin or you are a caretaker for someone on insulin. Hypoglycemia, glucose, glucagon. How do you manage all of this? And we're really fortunate to have Gary Scheiner talk with us. He's a longtime T1D, MS, CDCES. He's got a lot of initials. He is the author of Think Like a Pancreas, which is in his gazillionth printing. And he is the owner and founder of Integrated Diabetes Services on the East Coast of the US. As we always do a disclaimer, this presentation is provided to share knowledge with you about hypoglycemia and therapies, including glucagon. If you're using a DIY Loop app, please remember that today's information is to educate and assist you in consultation with your healthcare professionals in the management of your own diabetes. We are not your experts. You and your doctor are the experts. And let me just tell you, this has been cut down many, many times. There's a lot to say about Gary. He's going to be discussing, as I said, hypoglycemia, the best ways to treat highs, lows, rebound highs, sources of sugar, and all about glucagon. You may or may not have heard of it. Your doctor may not have talked to you about it. There's lots to know. And after 58 years with type 1 diabetes, I had a kit, never used it, and was kind of thinking I never would until I did. And once you need glucose that fast, you will not be without it. And that's why I think this is just absolutely essential. Gary's company, Integrated Diabetes Services, has a full staff of CDEs, I can't use their word, CDCESs, who live with T1D, and most are using DIY closed loop. And in-house, they collectively have been studying the use of glucagon with exercise. Gary's been guiding me a little bit on that, and it's really helped me quite a bit with lows that happen 20 minutes after I start working out. Most patients and caregivers do not know much about glucagon or how to use it or even have it on hand. And a lot of endocrinologists don't even make a point of mentioning it or writing prescriptions for T1Ds during office visits. So here's the quote that I really like. It's from David Panzirer from the Leona and Harry Helmsley Charitable Trust that funds a lot of research, and he has a child with diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is the only disease I know of where patients and caregivers are making dosing decisions for a drug that could kill you. And they are making these decisions 24/7, 365 days of the year. It's time critical, it's essential, and that's why we're talking about how to make sure you know how to manage the highs and lows. They will happen even if you're on loop. And so now I'm going to turn this over to Gary. I so appreciate your being here tonight. Take it away.
Oh, Joanne, it's an honor to be here. I'm in awe. The Loop and Learn group has an international reputation. You guys are known and honored and feared, I think, to some extent worldwide. You're like the commandos of the type 1 diabetes community. Nobody wants to mess with you. So I feel like I'm with my people here. I feel like I fit in pretty darn well. So I'm going to do a share screen. Let me see if I can get this to work. Yeah, this one.
And just a little housekeeping. Please keep your microphones on mute, and you can turn your cameras off or leave them on. That won't bother Gary at all. So take it away.
So are you able to see my screen in full?
Yep, we see you.
All right. So hypoglycemia it's near and dear to me. I've had type 1 for 37 years, and I've had my share of lows. In fact, I went back and did the math and just estimating how many lows I have per week times the number of years. And I guesstimate I've had a little more than 9,000 low blood sugars since my diagnosis. And, they say every low blood sugar kills a few brain cells. It's a miracle I've got any left after all this time. But luckily, there's a few marbles still working up there. Now, hypoglycemia, it's truly the limiting factor in all of diabetes management. If we didn't have to be concerned about low blood sugar, we could just load up on a mega dose of insulin every morning or once a week even, and just go about our business and not have to worry. But we're constantly playing this delicate juggling act of trying to avoid the lows. So just, by definition, we classify hypoglycemia into three categories. Mild lows technically is when glucose drops below 70. That's usually when the adrenergic symptoms appear, the shaking, sweating, the rapid heartbeat. People who have had diabetes a long time may not experience those, but those are the classic early warning signs that low blood sugar is taking place. Moderate hypoglycemia is when the brain starts to become impaired. It can't function the way it normally does. And that typically occurs when the glucose hits around 55 and below. So it's no coincidence that the CGM systems all have their default severe low alerts taking place at 55, because that's the point at which functional impairment starts to occur. Severe hypoglycemia doesn't really have a specific number associated with it. And that's simply a state where an individual can't independently treat themselves. They require outside assistance in the form of someone getting them food, somebody giving them glucagon, putting an IV in them, but they're not able to self-treat it. That's termed severe hypoglycemia. This is a comic that I really like. This woman's talking to her friend. His blood sugar must be low. He's been trying to turn on the TV with his glucose meter for 10 minutes. And I think those of you who have experienced lows or have loved ones who've had lows know that our moods, our behaviors, even our personalities can change dramatically when we're in a state of hypoglycemia. I'll share a brief story with you. This is an elderly couple that I've worked with for many years. The husband, Morty, has had type 1 for a long time. And his wife, Fanny, came to me and said, one time, she said, Gary, Morty's normally very quiet, but when he has low blood sugar, he starts to become amorous. He starts to kiss me and whisper sweet nothings in my ear. So I said to her, okay, so what's the problem? And she asked me, how long can I let that go on for? Well, we won't get into the moral issues involved there, but we can really become almost like different people when hypoglycemia sets in. We try to establish goals with all of our clients, specifically surrounding hypoglycemia and what we would consider acceptable. It's unrealistic for anybody with type 1 to say, I'm just never going to have low blood sugar. There's far too many variables that we're trying to juggle all the time to have zero hypoglycemia. The ones who manage to do that are most likely running their glucoses far too high most of the time. So we tell people, it's okay if you have a couple of mild lows a week. We certainly don't want them happening on a daily basis. But if you have a couple of mild lows a week that you can easily self-treat, that's okay. But we don't want to see any bouts of severe hypoglycemia. That's something we want to try to avoid entirely. And we also want to make sure that when you do have a low, that you recover quickly and don't overcompensate and wind up too high. So we're going to discuss in some detail in just a little bit about optimal treatment, and it does need to be customized. One other statistic I would throw out there is, since most of you are using CGM, is the percentage of time spent in a hypoglycemic range. And the goal there is try to keep that at or below 3%. Every 1% of time in a day is about 15 minutes. So if you're spending 4% of your time in a hypoglycemic zone, that's an average of an hour a day, and that's a lot of time. So, 1 or 2% we would consider acceptable for most people. So let's discuss some strategies for preventing lows first. I think the most important step in preventing hypoglycemia is having an insulin program that makes sense. Hopefully none of you are using NPH insulin anymore, because that stuff would peak at inexplicable times, and it would peak pretty hard often when you didn't need it to. So if it's nighttime or daytime NPH, the pink line represents the insulin and the white line represents typical background basal insulin needs, and you can see how it really doesn't come close to meeting a person's needs properly. So a lot of people now use long-acting injected basal insulin. And the issue here is that whether it's Lantus or Degludec or Toujeo, Tresiba, we usually set those doses in order to achieve stable blood sugars through the night. And in doing so, we're getting too much of that basal insulin during the daytime because our bodies tend to need less basal in the middle of the day. So it sets people up for hypoglycemia during the daytime. Pump therapy is the best option as far as an insulin program goes. If the basal insulin is matched to a person's needs, it's the best way to prevent hypoglycemia. But the key phrase there is the basal is matched to the person's needs, and that's not the easiest thing to do. Those of you who have ever worked with me or read my books, you know that there's testing involved, and we have to go through a battery of tests, fasting, to see how the glucose is during that fasting state. Is it rising, falling, or stable? We want stable glucose in that fasting state any time of day, nighttime, morning, afternoon, and evening. What about the food component? The timing of meals and snacks is important for preventing hypoglycemia. And if you're using NPH, it's a big deal. You cannot delay your meals. If you're using long-acting insulin, it's also a big deal, especially in the middle of the day. If you delay lunch or an afternoon snack or even dinner, chances are your glucose is going to be dropping and you run the risk of having a low. With pump use, it shouldn't be an issue as long as the basal settings are set up correctly. But also for those who are pre-bolusing, you have to remember to eat your meal. Pre-bolusing is beneficial for avoiding the post-meal spikes. But if you give your bolus and then get distracted and forget to eat your meal, you know what's going to happen. As far as the bolus doses, there's different elements to this. One part of it is the correction dose. And we want to make sure that the correction factor or the sensitivity that each person uses is matched to their individual characteristics. And the general rule is that the more insulin a person uses, the less every unit is going to drop them. So we usually take the number 1,800 or 1,700 and divide it by a person's total daily insulin dose. It gives us a good estimate of what their sensitivity factor should be. A lot of people find that they drop more per unit at night than they do during the day. So you may need different correction factors at night and daytime. The target glucose is another element of a proper bolus calculation. For most people, a target of 120 or 110 is reasonable. For very aggressive control, sometimes people use 100 as their target. We generally don't recommend targets below 100, even when using some of the more sophisticated systems like Loop, which I use personally. We find that in setting the target below 100, it just doesn't allow enough margin for error. So if you overshoot a little bit, you're likely to wind up hypoglycemic. The meal doses make a difference as well. The goal with a meal bolus is for the glucose to wind up close to normal 3 to 4 hours after the bolus is given. If you're concerning yourself with where the blood sugar is 2 hours post-meal, you could get yourself in some trouble because the insulin still has an awful lot of kick left at 2 hours. But 3 to 4 hours post-meal, if the glucoses are running too high or too low, then the dose most likely needs adjustment. The 2 hour post-meal reading is not a good time to look at. We can't learn a whole lot from that value. And as most of you probably know, the meal doses tend to vary by time of day. Morning doses are usually the most aggressive. When we're waking up from a fasting state, food digests faster and it raises the blood sugar more aggressively than it does later in the day. For those not using a pump, accounting for insulin on board, insulin is important, or I call it unused insulin. And using a 4 hour approach is a reasonable one, figuring that every hour about 30% of that insulin is used up. And it needs to be deducted from the dose you're about to give yourself. Otherwise, the insulin starts stacking on top of each other. But knowing how long your insulin takes to finish working is important to make this function well. And very few people actually know that. They may have been told by their doctor or their nurse, oh, just set it for 3 hours or just set it for 5 hours. And basically, they just picked the number out of their butt and stuck it in. They didn't really go ahead and see how long the insulin truly takes. The best way to figure that out is by looking at your CGM data after you've given a correction bolus. So this first example, we have about a 3-hour action curve. We're just looking to see how long it takes for the glucose to stop dropping after a correction bolus has been given. The second example is about a 4-hour action curve. In this last example, it took about 5 hours for the bolus to finish working. So if you look at a few of those with your own data, you can get a good idea of how long your insulin takes to clear. And it does vary from person to person. Accurate carb counting is another important aspect of preventing lows. It's just as easy to overestimate carbs as it is to underestimate. So getting accurate carb counts is pretty important. Knowing how to measure your portions. Looking up foods that you're not familiar with, especially foods when you're dining out or getting takeout. You can use carb factors where you weigh food and can get a very exact carb count based on the food weight. Make sure you're deducting the fiber grams from your carb counts. Now, the fiber is included in the total carbs on a label, but it doesn't raise blood sugar, so you can knock all of the fiber grams out. And if you're unlucky enough to eat something with a lot of sugar alcohol in it, you need to deduct half the sugar alcohols. This is the stuff they use in a lot of sugar-free chocolates and candies and things to label them sugar-free. The sugar alcohols, though, still raise the blood sugar a little bit, and they cause a lot of nausea. So hopefully you're not eating much of that.
Hey, Gary, a quickie, you might want to move your pointer off the middle of your slides.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Another way to prevent hypoglycemia is to extend the meal boluses. So the timing of the bolus is as important as the amount. If the insulin is given too early, a person's going to have hypoglycemia soon after the meal. Situations like very large meals require a delay or an extension to the bolus insulin. Meals or snacks that take a long time to consume, like holiday parties or hors d'oeuvres or just munching on popcorn during a movie. And meals that are very low on the glycemic index or foods, and that includes a lot of really high fat foods, because fat slows down gastric emptying, but also foods like pasta, especially al dente pasta and whole grain pastas, are very slow to digest. Legumes, things like beans and nuts and peas and lentils. These are starchy foods, but really slow to digest. Dairy products, slow to digest. Fresh vegetables. Most whole fruits are fairly slow, especially berries. And as I mentioned, foods that have a lot of fat content. And the way you can delay the peak of the insulin, if you're using a pump, is to extend delivery. On Loop, we use the absorption time feature. And I'll tell you from experience with this, using a 4-hour instead of a 3-hour absorption time makes about that much difference. It usually is not going to solve the problem. You have to get out to at least 5, 6, 7-hour absorption times for it to cut back enough on the initial bolus so that you don't go low with a slow digesting meal. Those on injections can delay their injection, give it after eating. You can split it into 2 parts, give half of it with the meal, half of it an hour or 2 later. And if you want to really get creative, keep some regular insulin around. Give yourself a shot of regular instead of a rapid-acting insulin with the slower meals. Physical activity is another major source of hypoglycemia, so adjustment has to be made with increases in physical activity. And this applies to exercise, but it also applies to just run-of-the-mill things we do during the course of the day. My blood sugars drop more when I do yard work than when I go to the gym. Cleaning, housework, yard work, these things all lower glucose levels. The adjustments we make often depend on the timing of the activity. Even with the newer features that are built into the hybrid closed loop systems, it's still often necessary to cut back on bolus doses prior to an activity. We can also use things like temp overrides in the loop to help with this. And we use carbohydrates for pre-meal activity, and we don't announce these carbs to the systems we're using. These are free carbs that are a secret. We just know we're going to be burning them up. And with prolonged activity, we often have to cut back on the basal insulin starting well ahead of time in order to prevent a low. Even if we get through the activity without a problem, we may not be out of the woods. There's a phenomenon called delayed onset hypoglycemia. These are lows that happen hours after a really hard workout or a long period of activity. And for activities like that, we often have to cut back on basal insulin, or we have to consume slow digesting snacks that we don't dose for, or lower the bolus doses that we give for a while after those kinds of activities. Alcohol is another source of hypoglycemia, and that's because it reduces the liver's production of glucose. Our basal insulin is meant to match the liver's sugar production. If the liver is making less glucose because of alcohol processing, we also have to make adjustments to the basal, or we'll probably wind up low. So basal insulin adjustments overnight are useful, and this can be set with a temp override, or consuming a slow digesting snack at bedtime after drinking without bolusing for it. Use of CGM obviously is a great tool for minimizing and reducing the risk of hypoglycemia. However, the alerts need to be set properly. It has to be set at a level above the threshold at which you want to catch it. So if you want to keep your glucose above 70, you can't set your low alert at 70, because now it's just going to catch it when you've gone below 70. And because of the lag time, if it thinks you've just gone below 70, you're probably below 60 already. So the threshold has to be set at least 10 points higher than the threshold at which you want to catch it. And of course, you have to respond to it immediately. No shutting off the alert and worrying about it later. Even if you set it at 80 or 90, you get that alert, you've got to take rapid acting carb, or you're likely to wind up below 70. This was some data from that studies Dexcom completed, showing how customizing the low alerts make a big difference. So the orange line represents the number of minutes per day someone spends in hypoglycemia if they use the default setting of 80 that's in the Dexcom G6. The green line represents people who set their low threshold higher. They set it at 85, 90, et cetera. And the blue line is for people who set it lower. A lot of times they put it at 70 or 60. You can see how much more time they spend in a hypoglycemic range, the higher they set that threshold. And of course, we've got to balance the nuisance of getting more alerts. We can't set the low alert at 120. It's going to be going off constantly. But do try to set it at least 10 points above where you actually want to prevent a low. Another thing this shows is use of the urgent low soon. This is the predictive alert that's built into Dexcom. The urgent low soon feature will tell you if it thinks you're going to hit that 55 level in the next 20 minutes. This could occur when your glucose is above 100. So it's a useful alert to use for prevention of hypoglycemia. So as this chart shows, the percentage of time spent in hypoglycemia comes down significantly in people who use the urgent low soon feature. Another way to prevent hypos is by using a hybrid closed loop system. We've got plenty to choose from now, including Loop, everybody's favorite who's on this call. Because these systems are automating insulin delivery and reducing basal delivery if a low is projected. It does help to cut down on the frequency, the severity, and the duration of the lows. You may not avoid all lows, but it'll certainly cut down on them. And last but not least, we have the diabetes alert dog. Dogs particularly, let's see, what's the breed that are used to this? Retrievers. Retrievers are the most commonly trained dogs to become diabetes alert dogs. They're trained to sense different glucose concentrations in their owner. And they provide, they'll paw at the owner or they might bark. They can be trained to do different things, but they're pretty darn effective for letting their owners know when their glucose is dropping. And this particular credential, the CPDTKA, that's the credential for training centers that really know what they're doing. All right, so let's shift gears now and talk about treating low blood sugar. It's a 4-step process. I'm going to go through each one in a bit of detail. It's necessary to check the glucose first. The CGMs are usually reliable for this, but not always. It needs to be treated with a rapid-acting carbohydrate in the right amount. And then we have to do a post-treatment check with a finger stick, and I'll explain why. Why is it important to check glucose first? Well, symptoms can be misleading. You may feel fine, but you could be low, and you could feel low and be fine. So it's necessary to check. It helps to know how low you are to know how much carbohydrate you're going to need to treat it properly. The Dexcom is a fairly reliable system when it comes to detecting lows and giving a reasonable value. But if the glucose is falling quickly, a finger stick will give you a more precise number because the lag time can create quite a bit of difference. I'm not as enthusiastic about the Libre system when it comes to measuring lows accurately. We see a lot of false lows with the Libre, so I always recommend finger sticks when it's telling someone they're having a low. Another reason to check, and this happens with any CGM, including the Dexcom, are called compression lows. You're probably wondering why I have a picture of Count Chocula on the slide. It's just to illustrate the what we call the vampire fang look that shows up on the sensor, this sudden drop and the sudden rise that follows it right away. These are lows caused simply by placing physical pressure on the sensor. The interstitial fluid below the skin gets pushed away and the sensor's not detecting anything. So it thinks the glucose has suddenly dropped when it really hasn't. So a finger stick is better than treating because that's not a true low blood sugar when that happens. Now the treatment, we want to use something that works fast. Nobody wants to sit around and wait for their glucose to come up. It's unhealthy, it's dangerous, and we want to get back to our lives. You don't want to have to wait forever. Glycemic index is a scoring system for looking at foods in terms of how quickly they raise the glucose. The higher the glycemic index, the faster the food turns to blood sugar. So we know from the studies of these kind of foods that liquids generally absorb and raise the sugar faster than solids. Warm foods work faster than cold, and the less fat and also the less fiber you have in the food, the faster it's going to absorb. So these are examples of common foods that have pretty high glycemic index scores. Things like crackers and bread and cereals and just sweet candies like jelly beans that don't have any fat content. Chocolate is not on the list because of the fat content. It's not a good food to use when we're low. It's delicious any other time, but it's not a good food to have when we're low. Neither is ice cream. It's delicious, but the fat and the dairy component slows down its effects. Ultimately, the best thing to use when we're low is dextrose. Dextrose is a type of sugar molecule. It's called a disaccharide. It's two glucose molecules stuck together. It's the closest thing we have to pure glucose in our natural environment. This is what's used in glucose tablets and the glucose gels, but it's also found in a lot of candies. The glucose tablets are not the best tasting thing, but a lot of people find these candies more palatable. And they also sometimes come in smaller pieces so you can portion them out a little bit better. Those candies are sweetened with dextrose, so they work just as well as the tablets. So what about the amount? Well, one size does not fit all. We often hear about just using 15 grams, but it doesn't work in a lot of situations. We can overtreat or undertreat if that's all we do. There's a number of variables that affect how much carb we need to successfully, properly treat a low. Body size has an effect. The bigger we are, the more carb we need. How low the blood sugar is has an effect. How quickly or slowly it's declining. Also, how much insulin on board do you have, and how much food on board do you have? Well, for example, if you have a low soon after eating half a pizza, it's probably because your insulin just peaked a little too soon. That food is going to be making its way through and into your bloodstream very quickly. So you may not need as much carb to treat a low under those conditions. But let's consider the body size first. And this is a chart I put together. There is no research to back this up. This is purely based on experience and empirical results we've seen when people of different sizes treat their lows. Somebody who weighs 60 pounds is going to come up about 7 points for every gram of carb they eat. Someone who weighs 200 pounds is only going to rise about 3 points for every gram of carb they eat. So obviously you can't use 15 grams to treat someone who's very small as well as someone who's very large, because they're not going to rise the same amount. So what I did is I combined body size and the glucose level on a chart. So somebody who weighs, a child who's 60 pounds and has a glucose of 70 only needs about 7 grams of carb to bring that up to 120. Somebody who weighs 200 pounds and has a glucose in the 40s needs 25 grams to bring that glucose level up. And so that rule of 15 is a fallacy. Sure, if you're 120 pounds and your glucose is in the 40s, it's the right amount. If you are, it's fine. Another one that's 15 grams. If you weigh 200 pounds and your glucose is 70, all right, 15 grams might work for you then. But there's not a lot of situations otherwise where 15 grams is actually the right amount. I like to simplify it with a sticky note, and this is just an example. Take a Post-it note and just write down, all right, if I'm in the 70s, have this much, 60s, do this much. And this is for somebody who's in that 100 to 140 pound category. You can create one based on your own body size. But you may want to edit this sticky note a little bit because there are some other factors to consider. When you're using a hybrid closed loop system like Loop or like Control IQ or Omnipod 5, you're going to need less carb to treat your low because the algorithm is cutting back on basal insulin before, during, and sometimes right after a low has taken place. And that's going to contribute to a rise on its own. Not as much as you might need, but somewhat of a rise. So if you normally need 20 grams to treat a low, and you're using one of these systems, you probably need to cut back to 15 or 12. Otherwise, you'll wind up rising a bit too much. How fast you're dropping is another variable. Most of us are using a Dexcom. With a diagonal down arrow, you can treat the normal with the normal amount. But if you've got straight down arrows, single or double, you're going to need a little bit more carb than you normally have. Because not only do you have to raise the glucose, you've got to reverse the downward trend. And it takes a little bit more glucose to accomplish that. All right, so we've measured our glucose, we picked the right food, we treated with just the right amount. What's next? For most of us, we sit and look at our Dexcom or whatever CGM we use and just wait for it to start showing a rise. And we wait, and we wait, and we wait. Sometimes half an hour goes by and it hasn't budged, even though we're feeling a lot better. And that's because continuous glucose monitors have a very long lag time when there are stress hormones circulating in the bloodstream. Blood flow is just not getting to the skin surface as much as it should. So even though your blood sugar's gone up, the sensor is not detecting it. So that's why it's important to get out your rusty, dusty meter and do a finger stick 15 minutes after you've treated. It's not necessary for your glucose to be all the way back to 120 or whatever your target is. As long as it's started to rise, you will be fine. Even juice or glucose tablets are going to take about an hour to fully digest and process. In 15 minutes, if you've started to come up, you're going to be fine. If you haven't risen in those 15 minutes, or if you drop further, then you should go ahead and repeat your treatment. What about severe hypoglycemia? And again, these are situations where you cannot self-treat. Somebody else has to get involved. It's very dangerous to try to force feed somebody who's unresponsive. They could easily choke and suffocate on any food that you happen to put in their mouth. So in a case like that, we turn to glucagon. The benefit of using glucagon rather than waiting for paramedics to arrive is that the longer you go without recovering from that severe low, the more significant brain damage can take place. There's also a good chance that if paramedics have to treat you, they're going to take you to the hospital and it becomes an entire day ordeal. The glucagon will help you recover quickly. Now, the good news is that this red box kit is no more. It's no longer being distributed by Lilly. You may be able to get them, but there's not going to be any of them after a short while. Why are they not selling them anymore? Because it stinks. It's a terrible kit. It takes about 20 steps because you have to reconstitute the insulin with a fluid. You got to dissolve it. You got to redraw it. You have to inject this big needle into somebody. And this is all being done by a layperson, somebody who has no experience giving injections, dealing with needles. And they're panicked anyway because their loved one is maybe having a seizure or foaming at the mouth or whatever. It's a very stressful situation. So most people who were tried to use this in an emergency were unsuccessful, but we have much better options now. My personal favorite is the Gvoke Hypo Pen. It's a very simple device. It comes in a package. You just peel it open, take off the red cap, and usually it gets put on it could be done on the leg, it could be done on the arm. All you do is press it into the skin for a 5-second count. It clicks, the little window turns red, and you're done. You never even see a needle. It's kind of like the modern EpiPens in the way they work. It raises the blood sugar starting in 2 minutes on average, and it works just as effectively as the old red box kits that no one could figure out. It's stored at room temperature. You got a 2.5-year shelf life. Very nice system. And there's another version of this that we'll talk about in just a moment called the Gvoke Hypo Kit, where the glucagon comes pre-formulated in a vial form, and it has to be drawn out by a syringe and injected. Now, for a loved one who's helping somebody with a severe low, this isn't the best option. The pen is, but there are some other ways of using this that we'll get to. There's a nasal spray that was developed by Lilly called Baqsimi. It comes in a plastic container. You stick it up the nose of somebody who's having the severe low, and you press a button, and it sprays the glucagon into the nasal cavity, where it absorbs pretty fast through the pulmonary circulation and works very quickly. Some potential downsides to it, though. People report a lot of pain in their nasal passages after getting it. It's a one-size-fits-all. With the Gvoke pen, they have two different sizes. There's a pediatrics and an adult size. It's really a 100-pound cutoff. The full dose is for people over 100 pounds. The half dose is for people under. The other issue we've had reported with the Baqsimi is that if somebody is having a seizure, it can be difficult to hold them still enough to put something in their nose. So that's why I like the Gvoke pen better. There's another pen on the market called made by Glucagon, and this is very similar to Gvoke, but it's only a one dose option. The Gvoke gives us a 2-dose option. All right, so something I know a lot of you wanted to hear more about is called microdosing of glucagon. There is no glucagon kit, not even the old red box kit from Lilly, that was approved by the FDA for microdosing. It's only approved for use in the full dose. So use of less than the normal dose is considered off-label. It's something you do at your own risk. Come hell, whatever happens, happens. I know our practice has been teaching patients about this, and we've been collecting data and learning from the experience of others. So use of this vial, the vial contains 20 units. If you want to think in terms of insulin units, there's 20 units of glucagon in here. You would not use the syringe that comes with it because it's a very large syringe. It's really meant for delivering the full amount. You would use a standard insulin syringe that has single and even half unit markings. And we found that taking anywhere from 2 to 4 insulin units of glucagon can be pretty effective for preventing hypoglycemia during exercise. There's been research on this led by my colleague and friend Mike Riddell up in Canada. And it's a pretty effective tool for preventing lows during workouts. But it can also be given in doses of 4, 5, 6 units at a time if somebody is having a low or approaching a low while they're nauseous. If you're vomiting and your glucose is dropping, what are you going to do? This stuff injected under your skin will do the job and help bring the blood sugar up. Once you take a few units out of here, you don't have to pitch it. This is stable 2.5 years. So you can keep this at room temp and use it several times if you choose to. But I will warn you, it's an acidic solution. It will sting if you give large enough a dose. Some people even feel quite a sting at smaller doses. I tried the first time I used this, and I'd heard about people taking 3, 4 units. I said, I'm going to do an hour run. I'm going to take 6 units. It felt like I got shot with a BB gun, and it stung a lot. And I didn't need that much. I was able to take less before running, and it kept my blood sugar nice and level. So from that standpoint, it is something that, off-label, you could potentially try. So just a few quick take-home messages. Low blood sugars are very problematic, and they're very common in all of us with type 1, even with the advanced systems that we use. And it is something we need to avoid. Apply those strategies that we talked about and try to get to those goals of minimal hypoglycemia in your life. And be prepared ahead of time with proper treatments. You'll find that if you wait until you're low to decide what you're going to eat, you're not going to eat the right things, and you're going to probably eat way too much of it. So plan ahead for that sort of thing. It really does make a difference. All right, so I guess we have some time for questions. I'm sure you've got a few.
Jumping back in here. Yes, there are questions. And I'll just start out with the one that came up on Facebook because it's fun. Can you use donuts for low blood sugars?
You can. They'll probably take longer to work than crackers. You could use anything for treating a low. It's just a matter of how quickly it's going to work and how much it's going to raise you. A small glazed donut has 30, 35 grams of carb. For somebody that weighs 150 pounds, it's going to raise them way too much. And it's going to probably take quite a while. You might not see a rise for at least 10 or 15 minutes. And it may take well beyond an hour to completely digest. So yeah, you can do it, but it's not your best option.
Gotcha. We have Tina and Ellen too. I'm going to start off with one, and then they can cycle through on questions. This is the first one I'm on is blood sugar in the 60s really hypoglycemic, or are we just worried about them because we're on insulin?
That's a really good question and a good point. There's different schools of thought on that. Some people really believe hypoglycemia starts at 55. Glucose is above that triggers symptoms, but the body can still function. But most people feel that, once those symptoms occur, we should treat that as hypo and consider it a hypo. The symptoms can be disruptive. The symptoms alone can make us act and do things out of the ordinary, not perform as well as we want. And we're pretty darn close to a dangerous situation, and it probably is best to consider anything below 70 a hypo. Pregnancy, we treat it a little differently. We usually use 60 as the cutoff for hypoglycemia, but for most adults, 70 is considered a cutoff. And we'll even use 80 in some people. Those who have had their share of severe lows were of significant hypo unawareness. We might use 80 as the cutoff for a low.
Okay, Tina, you got one? All right, I'll jump. Exertion lowers blood sugar, except when it doesn't, which I found happens when I'm really cranking and got stress hormones happening. Would you like to address that?
Yeah, I mean, every minute of every day, there's this balancing act going on in our bloodstream, things raising our blood sugar, things lowering it, and we want to try to make it even out. Now, with the physical activity, aerobic activity, cardiovascular types of activities will usually drive the glucose down quite a bit. But there are also some activities that drive us to produce adrenal hormones or adrenaline. Heavy weightlifting, competitive sports, sprints, things where we're getting scored or graded. The adrenaline is one of those factors raising the blood sugar. So if there's more adrenaline than there is muscle activity, the net result is a glucose rise. I think we all learn over time what kind of activities do that, and we can adjust for it. The majority of physical activities, though, will cause a decline in the glucose, and we need to prepare for that.
All right. Sorry about that. So what about powder glucose and gel glucose? Is there much of a difference between those and liquid?
Now, a powder, I'm not sure what you mean by a powder. I assume it's something you swallow.
Yeah, you can get bags of dextrose powder, and there's a brand called SOS that's like a little pouch.
I just want to make sure you're not talking about a nasal spray or glucagon. Again,
Glucose
tend to absorb a little faster. I don't know if there's a significant enough difference between a glucose gel and a glucose powder for it to matter. They're both going to work quite quickly. In fact, the powder may absorb a little bit better through the mucous lining of the mouth. You get a little absorption there too. So I think if you're using some dextrose containing solution, it's going to work nicely.
Okay. What about treating a low from the insulin hitting sooner than expected, such as often can happen with pizza?
Yeah, you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't in a case like that. To be honest, if you do nothing, it's probably a 90% chance your blood sugar is going to come up all by itself, and relatively soon. But I don't think any of us wants to take that chance that it won't. So we're going to have some rapid acting carb, try to get it up as quickly as possible. But that's why, again, it's so important to time our insulin properly to minimize those types of situations. So understanding the nature of how different foods digest and applying the absorption time or applying square, dual, extended boluses it's a valuable skill to have. And it can be done with any system now, even with the Omnipod 5, which doesn't allow extended boluses while you're using the algorithm. You just turn off the algorithm temporarily, do your extended bolus.
I think someone has their mic off because there's some background noise.
Are YouTube running?
Could someone turn that off? I had another question.
Thank you.
Ellen, were you going to ask? Your mic is off.
Oh, yeah. Do you enter rescue carbs into loop?
Do you enter rescue carbs into loop?
Yeah. Do you enter it in loop?
I found from personal experience, it's best to do it. It's almost never going to recommend a bolus, but if it knows what to predict, it can manage you better post-treatment, if that makes sense. Yeah, I've learned it's kind of like your spouse. You don't want to hide too many things. Be honest, be upfront with it, and treat you well.
Okay. But there are lots of questions on microbolusing.
What's a rescue carb?
When you have a low and you take, one of these fast-acting carbs that he was just talking about, like the powdered carb or the gel carb.
Or it's a dog that runs around with a tube of glucose tablets around. That's your rescue carb.
Got it.
Or candy.
Yeah. I got a question right here. Kind of goes back to the exercise and workouts. How do you, it starts out with help. How do you fix a high after a workout? Override is not working.
Also, if you've used the temp override and you still wind up low, you treat the low the same as you would any other. But keep in mind, if your insulin on board is lower than usual because of the override, you may not need as much glucose to treat the low. But also look at how many arrows are on screen. Exercise can sometimes make glucose drop really, really fast, and that may require additional carb in the treatment. But if you're after a workout and you've been getting less insulin, but you're still low, after the workout, most people can use less carb than they normally would, and they'll recover fine.
So I am one that subscribes to the not bolusing for fiber, but I know a lot of people do bolus for it, or they bolus for half of the fiber. Somebody commented that in here. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's different schools of thought on that as well. A lot of like the Dietetic Association and the ADA, they usually recommend counting half the fibrograms, deducting that when figuring out a meal dose. I believe that fiber causes no noticeable rise in blood sugar, and ultimately that's the most important thing. I also think we got to keep it simple. If we're trying to calculate half of things, just deduct the fiber. It's very simple to do. Base your dose on that. And you know what? If you're wrong, maybe you wind up a few points higher than you want. It's better than having a low.
I would agree. So would somebody ask, would half dose of a Gvoke pen work well for loopers?
Half a dose of a Gvoke pen, we're talking about a true severe low.
I'm thinking of a low that's kind of bouncing in the 50s, where a full dose might be a lot.
You can use microdose glucagon for treating mild and moderate lows, but you're really better off using food. This stuff's not cheap. I mean, these Gvoke kits are not cheap to obtain and use. Whereas you could just consume some rapid carbs and it'll work fine. But if you're nauseous, if you can't keep food down, you could probably give half or even a quarter of the vial contents. Again, the vial has 20 units, so you can give 5 to 10 units, and it would most likely work well for you. You can always repeat the treatment if your glucose doesn't come up.
One of the questions we have is, do you need to be careful about how often you use glucagon? Because it can cause the liver to empty and all sorts of other negative things.
Not really. The liver will repopulate its glucose stores fairly fast. Usually it takes a day or so, and the liver will be all topped out again. You should be fine. So you don't need to minimize your use of glucagon because you've used it sometime in the recent past.
I've wondered about that too with microdosing. If that is an effect that a lot of glucagon has, does microdosing make any notable change? But I take that as a no.
Now, the liver stores quite a bit of glucose. Think of it this way. A marathon runner can usually go about 2.5 hours and not suffer. A non-diabetic marathon runner can go 2.5 hours of all out running and not be hypoglycemic. Their liver's got enough glucose to handle that. So we're talking hundreds and hundreds of grams of glucose that are stored. So a few grams that this elicits is not going to make a dent in that.
A question about slow digestion, even not gastroparesis, and it seems to happen at any age. Does the rule of 15 minutes to retest or re-finger stick apply with people with slow digestion? In my experience, it takes longer. It takes way longer.
Yeah, it may take a little longer, but when we're in a state of hypoglycemia, gastroparesis often takes a back seat. It's not as pronounced as it normally is. Gastric emptying is accelerated when we're in a state of hypoglycemia. We often get some nutrient absorbing through the lining of the mouth and at the proximal end of the intestine. So even people with gastroparesis will usually get a fairly rapid recovery, and as long as they're using the right kind of foods in the right amount.
So with slow emptying or whatever we're calling the whole bunch of those problems, liquid or glucagon, less so glucose tabs.
Yeah, liquids are your best option if you have gastroparesis.
Got it. Interesting question about, I think the burning, does microdosing can in multiple areas of the body, would a little in each area, would you just poke around?
You could do that. Yeah. If you wanted to take 6 units in 2 units here, 2 units here, 2 units. Yeah, you could do that.
Like a little acupuncture.
I've been using, I'm talking to Gary, and I've been using microdosing because I get a sharp drop in blood sugar in 20 minutes after starting to exercise. It does burn. It burns like the dickens. 2 units. 1 unit doesn't. 2 units is enough, but not always. Have you found a place that works better than other places?
For the glucagon injection sites?
Yeah.
I've not noticed a difference, really. It seems to absorb pretty well. I've only used my abdomen when I've used the microdose glucagon, but it's an interesting question. I'll have to ask around some other places and see if people have noticed a difference.
One question we have is, have you heard if there is in development micro dosing of glucagon that's shelf stable?
Yeah, that's this.
Yeah.
That's the Gvo. Yeah.
You've got it. Oh, we have it. Yay.
It is not, again, it hasn't been studied, tested, submitted to the FDA, and approved for use in a microdose format. But this is out there, and anybody with an insulin syringe and half a brain can do that.
Are hypoglycemic? Oh, sorry, were you in mid?
Half a brain? Okay.
Did I
that's
interrupt?
all you need.
Okay. Are hypoglycemic symptoms relative to time and range?
I don't think so. I think the symptoms are more pronounced in people who don't have lows as often. And that's one thing we know, is that one way to restore the symptoms of low blood sugar is to avoid them for several weeks. You stay clear of hypos altogether. The brain cells that sense hypoglycemia become much more sensitive when the blood sugar is dropping. And then you start getting those adrenaline symptoms again. The more lows you have, the less sensitive you are to the lows. You have to get lower and lower before you recognize that a hypo is taking place. So I suppose somebody who's time in range, I mean, it's not directly related, but if somebody is spending a lot of time below range, I imagine they'd have less symptoms than somebody who's not spending a lot of time below range.
We have a looper that doesn't have a lot of lows, but he also hasn't been, he's hypo unaware and has been for forever. So that's interesting.
I got an interesting user here, Gary. God, that sounds like a radio show. I do between 4 and 10 glucagon shots daily as a way to manage my blood sugar. My endo is slow to get on board, but I have come to rely on it as much as I do managing my BG. I also use it for exercise as well as 100 other reasons. It zaps my low symptoms faster than carbs. What is the downside of, other than the cost of glucagon use?
I guess just the amount of work you're having to put in. And if you're having to use it that often, there's likely something amiss with your insulin program, whether it's your basal or your bolus or something is a bit off. It might be that you're just striving for control that's unnecessarily tight. And that's producing a lot of the lows and drops that you're experiencing. Nobody should have to be using it that much.
I noticed that when CGMs no longer required daily finger sticks, Medicare stopped covering test strips. Do you think there's any way we can get them to recognize that we still use test strips and they're actually valuable? Is it the medical community that has to let them know that? Or
I didn't know that that was still the policy. I
Yeah.
thought people on Medicare could get test strips now, even if they're using CGM.
Not covered.
It's not covered at all.
Mm-mm. No.
Hmm.
Which is crazy.
That's just shows how much they understand about this equipment we're using.
Yeah. Okay, John asks, if 70 is hypo, is regularly being 70 to 80 harmful if it doesn't go below 70?
If you can stay 70 to 80 and not go below 70, I'd like to meet you and learn how you're doing that. I don't know if it's really possible to accomplish, but I mean, it's truly, if you are not going below 70 and whatever if you're 70 to 80 all the time, more power to you. I doubt that that's sustainable for more than a few hours.
I think that comes from someone who has type 2, which may be that difference, a little more forgiving.
It's possible.
Yeah. And so a question, I had no low blood sugar symptoms until I started looping. Now I definitely feel them. I guess that's a good thing.
It is a good thing. That's an early warning sign that you get. So if your CGM is inaccurate or not functioning temporarily, you can fall back on, old reliable, your body's own symptoms letting you know that a low is occurring.
Here's a good question. Is the Gvoke kit vial still shelf stable after drawing your first microdose from it? And can you keep using it? And what about
I found that it is, and the people I've spoken with have found that it is. I can't say how long, because with only 20 units in there, nobody's had it last more than a few weeks. But since it's stable for 2.5 years at room temperature, my guess is that, once you start using it, probably like insulin, it's probably good for at least a month.
Can you put it back in the fridge to make it last a little longer?
No, it shouldn't go in the fridge.
Okay. Thank you.
Wait, I just missed that. What shouldn't go in the fridge?
The Gvoke kit?
Gvoke.
Really?
Hmm.
Oh, I was told it could go in the fridge by a Gvoke rep. Huh. Okay. I'll check up on that one.
Have you put it in the fridge?
That's where it lives right now. Yeah.
So then you're showing that it can be.
I haven't used it yet. So
Gotcha.
We'll find out. A business question: what happened to the Gvoke and the Baqsimi copay coupons? They were fantastic the last 2 years, but since summer they've barely touched the price at all.
I have no idea. You'll have to ask the Xeris rep and the Lilly rep about that. The thing about refrigerating the pen, it's possible that the medication is stable, but the pen itself, there's a lot of rubber components and plastic components that can start to stick if it's refrigerated. So that may be part of the problem. The packaging, the vial, the diaphragm on the top, there may be issues with those being exposed to constant cold temperatures. It's a little hard to puncture the diaphragm on the vial with an insulin syringe. And if you make this thing cold on top of it, it might be near impossible.
It's real hard. With the little needles, it bends. The needle.
Yeah, I sent you the
They're better.
little bigger syringe needles.
They're better. And the longer part of it doesn't bother me. There was a question about paying attention to IOB before you dose with glucagon. Do you need to pay attention, or is that an independent variable that you're not concerned about when you microdose?
The thing about IOB is it's often offset by FOB, food on board. So if it's IOB from a correction dose only, then yeah, it should be considered because you're probably going to continue dropping even more. If it's IOB from a meal and that meal is still digesting, I'm not sure I would take the IOB into account all that much. But as far as dosing glucagon, it's not like figuring out the carbs you're going to use to treat a low. This is very uncharted territory. I couldn't say that 3 units will work better than 2 under certain conditions. We're just thinking in terms of a few units here and there to try to deal with the situation or to prevent a low if you're about to work out. It takes some experimentation for each of us to figure out what works and what doesn't.
I have a
So-
caution that because of what we've been talking about, if you do use glucagon when you start exercise, make sure it's just before you start exercise, and don't decide to drive to where you're going to exercise, because by then you're shooting up from the glucagon, and that's a tough recovery. The other thing I talked to you about was when you use glucagon prior to exercise, what I've been doing is turning off the automatic bolus feature. So it doesn't start to try to chase the rise from the glucagon. I think that's what you said you found in your group.
Yeah, that's a good recommendation. I recommend within 10 minutes of the workout, that's when the glucagon should be given.
That's what I was going to ask.
I got one from a mom. The target range for school-age children, 8 years old, is breakfast cards need to be covered. Override would cause BGs over 190, but multiple recesses. What is the best strategy? Do you have enough information for that?
One of those long, convoluted, very specific questions to that situation. I put my email and phone number in the chat. If anyone has specific questions like that, feel free to contact me after the program tonight. I'm more than happy to address any other questions that people have. And certainly if anybody's interested in working with me or anyone on my team, I've got a team of 9 clinicians who all live with type 1. 8 of the 9 are loopers. We've all done the glucagon experiment. We experiment with everything. And we do virtual care all over the country. So if anybody's looking for some additional guidance, reach out. We'd love to work with you.
I have to mention that you have superstar Jenny Smith on your team, and Dana Roseman actually came and talked to us about nutrition and dosing. So if you haven't seen that video, it's in the YouTube channel. I guess I'll close out with this daunting question. If your blood sugar is under 55, you lose a brain cell that cannot be remade. Is that correct?
It is correct. We have billions of brain cells. So a few here and there should not make a difference. The good news was when they did post-analysis from the DCCT study, they found the people in the intensive therapy group from the DCCT who had a lot more hypoglycemia than the conventional therapy group. They found no difference in cognitive function 10, 20, 25 years out. So I think the traditional garden variety lows, if they're happening more often, it doesn't seem to have any noticeable effects on our brain function. Severe low is a different story. Prolonged severe hypoglycemia can be tragic, and it can really lead to severe damage.
I grew up with diabetes in the 60s and 70s, and there was a belief that low blood sugar was terrible for you. So some common thought was that you run high blood sugars, and that was equally devastating. But the people that grew up with that have trouble going low, only wanting to go low because they're scared of it. So, and I'm just going to answer a question for you, Teresa, who's watching on YouTube. The difference between the box of glucagon, the red box, and the microdosing sizes. That no, the difference isn't that it's just stable. It's that the red box is no longer being made. It's not available. The products that are on the market are available and self-stable for 2 to 3 years. Outside of the fridge. So
the red box was also an intramuscular injection, much longer needle. The Gvoke and the Zegalogue are both subcutaneous, much shorter needles that are used.
do you think Zegalogue is going to stay in the market?
They've got working arrangements with some of the companies that are developing dual hormone closed loop systems, so that may keep them afloat.
Okay, that brings up a question. Beta Bionics. Do you see that as a viable, cost-effective solution?
I hope it comes to fruition. To me, it's with them, it's like getting a car that's got a gas pedal and brakes. Everything else we use is a gas pedal only. we hope we can coast to a stop, but sometimes you've got to put a stop on it falling blood sugar. And glucagon is the only way to really do that in an automated way. So I think we can achieve a certain degree of control with an insulin-only system. If we really want to approach non-diabetes glucose management, we're going to need a system that has both insulin and glucagon. And in all likelihood, we'll probably need the amylin hormone as well to regulate the appearance of food in the bloodstream.
And I answered one for you, but and that was I've answered it. I'm not sure I'm right. Is Zegalogue a true glucagon?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I got it right. I think we've questioned you out. It's probably past your bedtime. But Gary, thank you. I think this is so very important. Is there anything we can do in our communities or with our healthcare professionals to educate them to understand the importance of this? Should we give everyone the quote that I used at the beginning and to say, hey, this is critical youth?
Well, I think it's more important at this point to teach about proper treatment of hypoglycemia. I'm trying to do more of that in the healthcare community with providers, because this notion of rule of 15, it's not right. It just doesn't work for the majority of people. Knowing the right way to treat a low makes a big difference. And it keeps people from progressing into severe lows and helps prevent the big rebound highs that take place afterwards. And we've all seen those. They're very frustrating. Mm-hmm. So doing the right job of managing lows with food, and then the glucagon if the food's not available, or if somebody's unconscious or nauseous and can't self-treat with food, then the glucagon's a good option. These GVO kits, for example, they're covered by just about every insurance. And it's very easy, and they're portable, and partners can carry them and keep them at their bedside if they need to use them. Though my wife would have loved to stab me with that old red box glucagon needle, but never had the chance.
I have to tell you, a couple of years ago, I went to a conference and was looking at a kit that was liquid glucose and it let you close the top. And I got real excited. I said, that's great. And there was a little CD standing in front of me, and she was poking at me, and she said, you're supposed to drink the whole thing. I said, well, I don't always need the whole thing. And she goes, yes, you do. And it started to look like it was going to be an argument, and I thanked her. So it's an education process. Absolutely.
Sure is.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. Like
Thank
I
you.
said, the reputation of this group is just off the charts. You guys have a world of respect worldwide for all you do and the teaching you do and the information you share. So keep up the great work. If you ever want me back, I'd love to come back.
You betcha. Thank you, Gary, so much. Have a great evening. What's left of it.
All right. You too.
All right.
Night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.